Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Money and Macro Talks. Today, we're interviewing Jan Stuhler. Jan is a professor of economics at Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. He is also the author of many influential papers exploring the intersection of immigration and labor markets, which will be the focus of today's conversation. So, Jan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Great to be here.
So I want to start by asking you a big picture. Many people think about the effects of immigration on labor markets in terms of simple supply and demand. If you have more workers coming into an area, you will increase the supply of workers. That would push down the price of labor, which are wages. So natives will get, negative outcomes. So first I wanted to ask you what is right and what is wrong about this framework, and what should we keep in mind when thinking about immigration and wages in terms of supply and demand?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there are sort of two main ways to think about what immigration does. And the first way to think about immigration is simply as a sort of supply shock. And this sort of framework that people think about, you can think about that as the ECON 101 framework, right? Like the really sort of simple supply-demand arguments. That's a framework that's sometimes called the factor proportions model. So that's a worldview where production depends on different factors. It depends on capital. It might depend on land. And it depends on labor. It depends on how many workers you have. And in that framework, the mechanisms are very simple. It's if you have a supply shock in one factor, then you would expect the price of that factor. So for example, for labor, the wage to go down. And so if you have additional immigrants coming in, that's like a positive supply shock for the factor labor. If the other factors of production don't immediately adjust, then at least in the short run, you would expect some negative wage effects. Okay, so the starting point is sort of very simple, very logical, but then of course you can sort of bring in, this idea about different skill groups, different types of labor, and then things are becoming a bit more interesting.
Okay, so before we talk about how immigrants bring different skills and perhaps compete with specific groups of natives, I want to still focus on this general supply and demand framework. And I think it's really interesting to think about short-term effects and long-term effects if we have this model in mind. So in the short term, it's possible that new immigrants can compete for existing jobs with natives. But I wanted to ask you about how can firms adapt their capital to sort of mitigate these wage effects. How do you think about this?
Exactly. So the effects that I just mentioned, sort of this decline in wages, that's the effect you would expect in the short run. So in the short run, an additional inflow of workers might bring down wages, and it might increase actually the return to the other factor, to capital. Okay, so for firm owners, this might be a good thing. You suddenly have access to more workers who are potentially cheaper. And so that means in the long run, of course, you would expect capital and you would expect firms to respond to this inflow of additional people, of additional worker. And that means if you have an immigration shock, in the long run, you would also expect capital to adjust. So the standard models in this literature, they actually predict that the long-run effects of immigration, at least if it's skill neutral, would actually be zero, because eventually the other factors of production adjust. So to the extent that we have concerns about the impacts of immigration, often these concerns are more focusing on the short term rather than the long.
Right. And it's important to make this distinction, because one thing that we've learned from many economies around the world is that there is not a fixed number of jobs in the economy, right? Economies are able to absorb more workers and generate more jobs. Or if you look at countries that have received many immigrants over the past years, they've also increased the number of jobs. So, yeah, perhaps there's a fallacy here, like thinking about a world where the supply of jobs is fixed, right?
Exactly. I mean, the short run, that might be sort of somewhat reasonable starting point, but in the long run, certainly not, right? In the long run, we would expect it's sort of the idea is very simple, that if you sort of have suddenly twice as many people in a country, you probably in the long run are also going to have twice as many firms and twice as many jobs. And that idea is, of course, contained in the standard models. Now, once we talk about difference across different types of workers, for example, difference in education and difference in the skills, then you might also expect some sort of more long-run effects to the extent that, for example, immigration really changes the distribution of skills in an economy in the long run. Okay, but sort of the simple argument, additional workers, sort of increase in labor supply affects wages. That argument is really a short-term argument focusing on the short term.
Sure. So let's think of an example here. Let's think of a country that has a sudden inflow of immigrants, and those immigrants are mostly lower skilled, and perhaps they don't are fluent in the native language. Okay. So what that means is that the types of jobs that they can look for are not going to be the types of jobs that many natives
Right.
work. So what would be the expected effect of this hypothetical?
Yeah, the implications of these type of factor proportion models are very simple. The implications are that an increase in the supply of any particular factor is sort of bad news for other people who are in that type of labor. So if we have an inflow of mostly low-skilled immigrants who, as you say, is gonna access certain type of jobs that maybe need less education, fewer formal skills, that is, in a factor proportions model, is bad news for natives who are also working who have similar education and who work in these type of jobs. So you would expect that wages of low-skilled natives would go down, at least in the short term. Again, we need to make this distinction between short and long term, while the wages of high-skilled, for example, might actually go up, because the way we think about it is that different factors of production have some complementarity. So if you suddenly have more low-skilled workers in the economy, the skills of the high-skilled are becoming more valuable. And so for them, actually, more low-skilled immigration might actually be good news in terms of their wages.
So I have one example in mind, which I think is very illustrative, and then I will ask you to, provide an example also, because I think, examples help, illustrating this point. I think about domestic workers, for example. So in my country, in Spain, we have had a really intense influx of low-skilled women, mostly from Latin America. Many of them have ended up working in the domestic service sector. And what some studies have found is that domestic workers help high-skilled women increase their labor supply. I mean, if you are a mother and you have 2 children, you could really use some help around the house, and that would allow you to, be more productive. So in one sense, these domestic workers are complements to local high-skilled women. However,
Exactly. Yeah.
it is also possible that this influx of domestic workers have had negative effects for existing domestic workers that were employed in Spain 30 years ago. So this is one example. I don't know if you have other examples in mind that can help, illustrate this skill composition effect.
Yes, exactly. I think this is a good example. I mean, it sort of highlights exactly as you said, that if you have inflow of certain type of workers, that might affect other workers who have different types of skills actually positively. Now, the mechanism at play in the context that you just mentioned is, of course, a bit more complicated. It happens not just in terms of wages, it also happens in terms of labor supply, like really in terms of whether women are working in the first place or not. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Spanish context. It actually has a student working on that. And as you said, it's very intuitive that probably one reason for increased labor supply of high-skilled women in Spain is that due to immigration, they had much easier access to domestic workers. And so, of course, you can make the same argument for male workers, but, this tends to have a gender dimension. And so you sort of have you can think about 2 forms of complementarity. One is like really on the labor market itself, in that, less and more skilled workers are working together. And so if you have more less skilled workers, that maybe makes the more skilled workers more productive. But then in this setting, you have this additional channel that actually goes through households and labor supply decisions within the household, which increases this potential complementarity even further. Now, one thing, if I sort of may mention this research of my student, one thing she found that is interesting is that the effects of that were concentrated among women who actually had sort of medium education and income. And the intuition there is very simple, is that if you're a family that has very high income, then you can afford domestic workers, no matter whether there's immigration or not. If you have very low family income, you cannot afford a domestic worker even with migration. So it's sort of the families that are sort of in the middle of the income distribution for whom the arrival of migrants and sort of this sort of supply shock in the supply of domestic workers makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting to see the distributional aspect here, right? So some families can benefit from domestic workers, but there is a distributional effect here. Like
Yes.
low-income families perhaps don't feel any benefits from these increased inflow of low-skilled immigrants. However, sort of middle-income families, they do see a benefit. So other examples, for example, let's think about construction, let's think about hospitality sector. Some of these types of jobs, they are more manual, and they don't, well, in hospitality can be different, right? But let's think of manual labor. So construction, for example. Should we expect similar dynamics here?
Yes, I think so. As you said, there's certain industries that had many high-income countries have very high migrant shares, such as construction, the care sector, for example, hospitals or care homes for the elderly. Agriculture is often very dependent on migrant labor. And you mentioned the hospitality sector. That's also true. It's a sector where you typically have a high migrant share. And so these are sectors where you sort of need relatively few formal skills to enter them. And then the distributional effects are, as you said, for those native workers who are either already in that sector or maybe for some reason would have been likely to enter that sector, this is potentially bad news. It's more competition for jobs. You can make the argument, we will come back to that, likely wages are under pressure because of the inflow of migrants into that sector. And so if those natives who are kind of, for some reason or other, sort of linked to that sector, that's potentially bad news. Now, for other natives, it's of course potentially good news. It means that these type of services are becoming cheaper. The reason why strawberries are so cheap in the supermarket is because this is basically, this industry is run on immigrant labor that is paid very, very badly. So we sort of, the more skilled workers, they see these more indirect effects, positive effects of immigration in terms of lower prices of construction, lower prices for agricultural products, and so they profit. Now, one sort of debate in the literature is to what extent natives are then really stuck in those sectors where they're competing with immigrants. Like sort of one hopeful story is that, okay, maybe if you're a construction worker and you see that sort of there's more and more competition for these construction jobs, then maybe you can go to another industry that is less exposed to immigrant labor, maybe using some of those skills that maybe the immigrants have less, like such as your language skills. And so maybe you can just go to a sector that, that is reliant on good language skills and where you're not exposed to this immigrant competition. And maybe that is even sort of like a positive career move for you. Okay, so that's I think where the literature sort of is a bit divided. You're going to get different views on how important this mechanism is and sort of what it means for the overall effect of immigration.
I can definitely see some perhaps examples of, let's stick to construction, right? Once you have this increase in the number of workers looking for construction jobs and you are native, you can perhaps leverage your comparative advantage and move up the occupational ladder and become like the person who coordinates this new pool of workers who don't have the language. And that can be perhaps a success story. The question obviously is to what extent this is the main dynamic here, or this is just some examples. Like, it comes to my mind that this influential study in Denmark, where they have pretty complete data, and they're sort of able to show that this effect exists, like it's possible for natives to move up the educational ladder. Other studies have also suggested that it is also possible for natives to retrain and perhaps get more education. And yeah, so how do you weight this effect?
So I think this is sort of now where different researchers are going to give you slightly different answers. So my view is that, yeah, so this mechanism is very intuitive, right? Is that you, let's stick with the example you gave, maybe you're a construction worker. Now suddenly you have a lot of other construction workers coming from other countries. And so maybe you can upgrade to be the coordinator. I actually don't remember how this is now called in the construction sector. I guess the foreman. That maybe you are now the one coordinating between sort of the central office or the customers and the sort of the more basic construction workers. Of course, intuitively, there's a level to what extent that type of occupational upgrading can occur, right? You probably need fewer coordinators than you need actual construction workers. So not every construction worker can upgrade to that role. And so intuitively, if this sort of upgrading occurs, it probably needs to, and it really helps, it probably needs to happen at a broader level, right? So rather than just upgrading within construction, probably some natives would need to move to other types of occupations, like really switch occupation or switch industry. And then, of course, the same argument might apply that might again be sort of actually beneficial for them. Now, I think the empirical evidence on that is sort of divided. So the Danish paper that you mentioned, that's a very nice paper. They have very good data. And so that's probably a sort of piece in favor of this sort of upgrading mechanisms. But a lot of the evidence out there in economics that claims to show upgrading is actually not following individual workers and showing that these individual workers are really upgrading. Instead, what many papers show is that once you have immigrants coming in, you have fewer native construction workers, or let's express it differently. Once more immigrants come in, the share of native workers who are in more skilled occupation increases. But of course, the share of native workers who are in skilled occupation might increase simply because fewer natives find manual jobs. So, this increase in the share of native workers who are in skilled occupations might actually reflect not individual upgrading, but it might reflect the sort of crowding out effect that you might also have in the labor. And so I think this is sort of a literature that's very interesting. I think where we need more evidence, like how quantitatively important this really is to understand how much it really shapes the overall effects of immigration.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. And I intend to ask you about why so many papers reach different conclusions and what are the sort of empirical challenges in trying to get to the causal effect of immigration on labor markets. But before we go there, we already talked about, it's possible that natives can react to an influx of immigrants by perhaps getting more education, finding another job, or perhaps moving to another city. So I want to also ask you about these potential effects on the geographical mobility of natives and how can these interact with the wage effects?
Yeah, I think geographic mobility is certainly an important adjustment mechanism. It depends, of course, a little bit on what type of immigration has happened. In a setting where immigration happens only in specific regions, there are some famous cases in the literature, like, for example, this migration wave of Cubans to Miami is, I think, the most well-known example. There, it's very natural to think about geographic adjustment as an important factor, right? Maybe natives can just go to other cities. But nowadays, in many high-income countries, immigration is not concentrated just in one city, right? It's sort of all over the country. And then I think this geographic adjustment mechanism is of limited importance because for natives it's not so easy to avoid immigration, right? And in many countries in Europe, for example, we had increasing immigrant shares in all the major cities. You can't avoid immigration by going from one big city to another. And, there might be some more rural areas where immigration shares are very low. But of course, those areas don't have the same type of jobs. So I think this really depends on context. In some context, you might expect it to be sort of an important adjustment mechanism. But I think if we sort of talk about the wider influence of migration nowadays in countries that have very high immigration rates, I wouldn't expect this to be sort of sort of the main solution for affected workers.
For example, when I think about Spain, it is true that migrants tend to concentrate in the largest cities, in the more dynamic cities. But these are also cities that have seen housing prices skyrocket. And, I think immigration has some role on this. But second order effect of this dynamic is perhaps that it used to be the case in the 80s and 90s. You had all these low-skilled people from different provinces in Spain moving to Madrid, moving to Barcelona in order to find better jobs. But now, with housing costs, very high, I've seen some evidence that people are moving less. And this is perhaps some interesting indirect effect of immigration on wages, right? Like they are adding to the congestion in the biggest cities, and that lowers the mobility opportunities for other Spanish workers.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's very intuitive, right? Again, this is sort of like a debate in the literature to what extent this is empirically playing out, but the mechanism is very, very clear, right? That let's take you mentioned the Spanish example, let's take the US example. We had a lot of, for example, international immigration to California and other US states that are close to Mexico and Latin American countries. And of course, it's one potential effect of that is that maybe fewer natives are going to move to California or to these other southwestern states in the US. And I have a colleague, Michael Emoa, who actually shows that this seems to be true, that immigrants move to where opportunities are, for example, to California in the US context, but to some extent that might, of course, crowd out the native inflows, population flows into the mechanism, as you said. One mechanism is the housing market. So we can think about that again through this lens of this traditional factor proportion model. So housing or land and housing is a factor that cannot so easily adapt, right? There's congestion. You can't keep building and building more in cities. And so that's, of course, going to make these effects a bit more persistent. And it's also interesting to think about in terms of who benefits and who loses from immigration. Housing owners, those who own the capital stock, but also the housing stock, they are very clearly the ones who benefit from immigration. And so if you own an apartment in one of these big cities in Spain, in Madrid or Barcelona, then, of course, potentially immigration is something that's good for you because it's going to raise the rents that you can ask for.
Yeah, absolutely. So far we have discussed many different potential mechanisms through which different groups of migrants can affect different groups of natives. And one thing that comes up in this debate about immigration and labor markets is that you have many different papers trying to look at data from different countries, looking at city level data, looking at district level, state level. You have many different empirical approaches, and perhaps as a result, you get many different results. This complicates the debate because you will always have people with a paper in mind that they can throw at you, in a debate to confirm their position. But help us navigate through this literature. Why are different empirical papers reaching different conclusions about do immigrants negatively impact wages of natives or employment of natives?
I think it's a good summary. I think this is a literature that is controversial. It's controversial because it's politically charged, but it's also controversial because the evidence is not as consistent as we would like it to be. And I think there are two main reasons for that. I think the first reason is that this is really just a difficult causal question to answer because there is a lot of selection. Okay, so when in economics and in other sciences, when we talk about estimating causal effects of something, we're always worried about selection. We're always worried that sort of the regions that are experiencing some economic event of interest or the individuals who experience that are different from the regions or individuals who don't experience it and who are supposed to be our control group. And immigration, it's one of these contexts where there's a lot of selection. So immigrants, of course, tend to go where there are economic opportunities, right? So they move to London, they move to California, they move to places that are very dynamic and where there's a lot of job creation. And that makes it very hard to distinguish the causes of immigration from its effect. Right. So is London doing well because of all the immigration, or are all the immigrants in London because London has been doing well? So it's sort of this problem of reverse causality that we typically always have in economics, but I think it's particularly severe in this question on immigration. And one reason why it's particularly severe is first there's a lot of selection, obviously, from the immigrants themselves. And then clearly the places that receive high immigration, they're very different from the places that don't receive many migrants. So in most countries, immigrants are clustered in the big cities, in the metropolitan areas. And the regions that have the lowest immigrant shares are the rural rural areas that are much less dynamic, that have a very different industry structure and occupation structure. And so I think one concern of this literature is that it's very hard to control for that. I do think there are studies out there that are essentially comparing wage growth in big metropolitan areas to wage growth in more rural areas, and no surprise, they find more growth in the big metropolitan areas that have high migrants. Okay, so it's a very difficult causal question. The second reason I think why it's very difficult to get good answer is that it's the distributional effects that we mentioned at the beginning. So if you have immigrants coming in who are, for example, who are less skilled than natives, well, they're going to compete mostly with natives who are less skilled than the average native. And if there are employment effects, then one thing that you would expect is that maybe you see a decrease in the employment of natives with low wages. And that would, of course, mechanically drive up the average wage in the region. Okay, so you can kind of have this perverse effect that, migrants come in, there might be employment effects on low-wage natives. You might see fewer of them in employment. And that, if you have fewer of these, let's say, construction workers earning low wages, if you have fewer of them around, you have fewer, let's say, nurses earning native nurses earning low wages, you have fewer native workers in agriculture earning low wages. The average wage of natives might actually go up because you don't see these people anymore in employment that had low wages before. And so to address that type of problem, it's very difficult. It's probably easier if you have panel data where you can really follow workers over time, which we have in many European countries, but which, at least until recently, we, for example, didn't have in the US. So almost all the US studies, including sort of very well-known one on immigration, they use cross-sectional data. They can't follow the same worker over time. And so when you use this cross-sectional data, it's very easy. You see an increase in average wages in a region. It's very difficult to say whether this is sort of due to causal effects of immigration or due to changes in the composition of the workforce that you might not fully understand because you're not able to track workers. Okay, so I think that is the two key reasons why this is a literature where, even after all these studies, it is a difficult question to answer.
So, summing up, there are two main reasons why one, when navigates this literature, can have the impression that there is no consensus here. One first reason is that it's very difficult to disentangle correlation from causality, as you said. No, is London doing good because of immigrants, or are immigrants in London because London is doing good? It's very different, very difficult question to answer. And also, sometimes you have to be more specific in your question, like what is the impact of immigrants on natives? You perhaps want to fine-tune your question and ask something like, what are the impacts of this specific group of immigrants on this specific group of natives? And perhaps you will get more interesting questions. So
exactly. Can I add one thing?
Sure,
I don't want to,
I
don't want to leave my profession as looking as if we don't agree on anything.
Yeah.
So I think there is pretty wide agreement in terms of qualitative questions, like who are the winners and losers from immigration. I think there's pretty wide consensus on sort of this distributional question. What is, I think, where we lack consensus is sort of what's then the overall or average effect, right? Do average wages go up? Do average wages go down? I think that's where a lot of the disagreement is. But if you ask me sort of which are the groups who are potentially profiting from immigration, or which are the groups who are potentially, for whom more immigration is potentially something negative, at least in the short term, I think there's agreement on that question.
Definitely. So we started this conversation thinking about the simple model of supply and demand, where, more workers, average wages go down. But, we know that labor markets are not usually perfectly competitive markets. And I wanted to ask you, because you have done some research on this, how can immigrants affect labor market institutions at origin?
Exactly. I mean, everything we discussed so far was based on this type of factor proportions model, where the idea is that everybody's wage is equal to their marginal productivity, as we call it in economics, right? So basically, everybody's wage reflects their productivity. And so in that type of world, the only way how immigration affects wages is by actually affecting productivity, right? That if you suddenly have more workers with less skills, then maybe the average productivity of these workers goes down because you have so many of them. But sort of like a second way to think about immigration is that maybe it's not just about sort of the quantity of labor that is coming in. Maybe it's also about how they behave on the labor market, in particular, what type of wages do they demand to be willing to work. And I think there the sort of very intuitive idea is that in many countries, new immigrant arrivals, they might have lower reservation wages than natives. Okay, by reservation wage, we mean what's sort of the minimum wage for which you'd be willing to work. And so there are many intuitive reasons why, if you sort of just newly arrived to a high-income country, maybe from a low-income country, you don't have much savings, you're sort of forced to work as soon as possible, maybe you don't have access to many good jobs. There are many good reasons to expect that migrants might have lower reservation wages than natives. Now, in the traditional type of models, in the factor proportion model, that doesn't make much of a difference because, what your reservation wage is not so crucial. What is crucial is what's your productivity, because you're going to receive your productivity. But if we live in a world that's not fully competitive, where, for example, firms have what we call monopsony power. So what monopsony power means is that firms can get away with changing a bit their wages without potentially losing all their workers. So in the competitive model, every firm pays the same wage to the same type of worker. And if you're not willing to pay that wage as a firm, you're not going to be able to hire any worker, right? There's sort of like a going wage and you have to pay it. With monopsony, it's not like that. With monopsony, to some extent, firms can choose if they are paying high wages, then it's easier to attract workers and easier to hire more workers. Or if I'm a firm that actually tries to get away with paying low wages. And if I pay low wages, sure, that's going to make it harder to hire workers. But maybe it's not a 0-1 question. Maybe I can still hire some workers. In particular, maybe I can hire some of these immigrant arrivals who came in recently and who don't have access to good jobs yet and might be willing to accept low wage offer. And in that type of world where firms have monopsony power, immigration has sort of this additional effect on the labor market, which comes from this idea that firms realize that some of these immigrant workers have low reservation wages, and so firms might have this incentive to try to get away with offering lower wages, even if there are no changes to productivity. Okay, so it's a completely different channel, but it's a channel that actually, I think in the public debate, is very intuitive, right? There's often, when you read newspaper articles, when you ask people about their concerns about immigration, there's often this concern that somehow immigrant arrivals are working for too low wages. And in the competitive model, that concern doesn't make much sense, right? Because everybody gets paid their marginal productivity. But in a world where there's monopsony power, that concern makes a lot of sense, right? That somehow maybe one thing that's going on, that in response to immigration, there might be some firms that in some sense start specializing on immigrant labor, that firms that sort of offer relatively bad pay, but it still works for them because they have access to the source of labor that is, at least where some workers are willing to accept those type of jobs.
And can you talk more about your study for Germany? How can you explain us briefly, how did you design it? And what do you find relative to this mechanism that you were highlighting?
So in this study, that's together with my co-author Michael A. Moir, who has worked on this question of monopsony and immigration for quite some time. And so we have sort of both a theoretical and an empirical part. So in the theoretical part, we are just formalizing this argument that I just gave you, right? That if you have an inflow of workers who have relatively low reservation wages, then some firms might respond by lowering their wage offers. So in the sort of model that we describe, you have this concept of a low pay sector, right? And if you have more immigrants coming in with low reservation wages, that might lead to the emergence of a low-pay sector, firms specializing on hiring workers at low pay, or it might increase the size of the low pay sector. And we sort of argue that this is a very intuitive idea. So we provide some evidence from the German context where there was a large immigration wave in the early 90s. And so we did some search on what's being discussed in newspaper articles, what type of concerns are being discussed. And what comes out of it, it's the concerns were often not so much about sort of how many immigrants come in. The concern was about this concept that you can translate as dumping wages. This idea that somehow some immigrants are working at wages that are too low. And the model we describe is sort of formalized this idea, right? That this is indeed, if you have monopsony power, if firms have monopsony power, that is a concern, that firms might start specializing on migrant labor. They might sort of make these dumping wage offers and then, of course, mostly hire immigrant labor. And that's indirectly bad for natives because it means some part of the jobs out there are in some sense not for them anymore because they are offering wages that where natives are just not willing to accept. Now, unless you have some questions on this sort of conceptual part, let me describe what we do empirically. Sure. So empirically, sort of the research design is fairly standard. We're using regional variation in immigrant inflows. We're trying to get around this reverse causality problem that I mentioned to you in the beginning. There's some technical details that I don't want to bore your listeners with that, but we're trying to find what we call exogenous variation, how different places were affected by immigration. And then we see what happens to employment, wages in those places that receive more migrants. And so that sort of beginning of the empirical study is very standard. And so we see that native employment goes down to some extent. With wages, it's a more complicated story because of these compositional effects that I mentioned. But if we sort of deal with these compositional effects, then we also see that wages, at least in the short term, are going down in those places that receive more migrants. Now, the novel part, and I think the really interesting part, is to then split up these employment and wage effects across the distribution of firms. So we have data where we can observe individual establishments or firms. And so we look at what happens to wages and employment among firms that pay low wages and among firms that pay high wages. And so consistent with this conceptual framework of monopsony, we see that these negative short-term effects of immigration, they're very concentrated among the type of firms that are paying low wages. And so that it's sort of this idea that if you're like a native worker and you're working maybe for like a large firm paying high wages, think about, IBM or, like a big tech company, this sort of arrival of immigrants with low reservation wages is not a huge threat for you because you are working for a firm that has chosen a high pay strategy and they're not going to suddenly start offering dumping wages for just because immigrants come in. But if you're a native worker who's connected or who's working for, let's say, like a small firm, a sort of like the corner shop somewhere in the city that's already not starting, that didn't pay great wages even before immigration happened, for that type of worker, immigration is a potential threat, right? Because those type of firms that are already on the lower end of the wage distribution, they now have this incentive that maybe due to immigration, maybe they have this incentive to start specializing to some extent on immigrant labor, to make even lower wage offers, knowing that even though the natives are not willing to accept those low wage offers, some of the immigrants might. And so we provide evidence that this sort of mechanism is really at play, at least in this particular context in Germany, where there's also reason to suspect that the immigrants had relatively low reservation wages.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting dynamic. When I think about monopsony power, I think about how many different options you have to work in for different employers. When you have many options and many places that you could potentially work, if some employer offers a low wage, you can say,
just go to
I
the
will
next
try
one.
to let's try to look at the next one if it's better. But you can arguably say that immigrants have less options, and perhaps it's because if you don't have a fluent knowledge of the local language, your set of options shrinks. Or we can also think about if you're an irregular immigrant and suddenly your potential pool of employers are just a handful that are willing to pay you informally, which gives them a lot of power a lot of bargaining power in order to set
power.
the terms. Yeah. Some similar dynamics may be going on in the US with I think they have visas tied to employers. It's like you can work there, but just for this employer.
It's not so easy to switch. Exactly.
It's not so easy to switch, right?
Exactly,
so that can create. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting case. And there's some recent work looking at specifically at that. It's an interesting implication that if you have like visa policies that make it harder for migrants to move to your new employer, that can actually backfire, right? In the sense that, then those immigrants are forced to work for relatively low wages. And then some firms are going to specialize in that type of labor. And that's bad for natives because then those firms are not creating jobs for them, but for immigrants. So once you bring in this, I mean, we're going to talk about policy later, I guess, but once you bring in this monopsony argument, one thing I find exciting about it leads to very different policy implications and sometimes surprising policy implications. And sort of the main theme that you actually get is that, you want immigrants to do well on the labor market to protect natives, because if immigrants are doing well, if they're not forced into these jobs that are paying dumping wages, that indirectly protects natives from this low wage competition. That's kind of
so. Jan, what are the different ways, or what are the different policy levers that governments can try to move to try to mitigate this negative effect of immigration on wages?
Yeah, let's start very briefly with a traditional competitive model, the factor proportion model. In that type of model, actually governments can do very little, right? Because it's all about what type of skills different workers have. And so the only type of policies that could work is that, if you foster upgrading, if you sort of foster skill accumulation, if you maybe make it easier for natives to gain more education. And so these are type of policies that are kind of very intuitive, but this is something that policymakers are trying anyways, to have more skills in the population and to have more education, and it's not so easy, right? It's not so easy how that's gonna sort of solve the issue. Once you bring in this monopsony argument, you have very different policy implications, right? Because then the intuition is that maybe part of the potential issue is just the fact that immigrants are willing to accept these low wage offers. And then any type of policy that prevents that could potentially be useful. There are some very obvious policies, such as minimum wages, right? Like in that type of world, minimum wages are useful because they potentially protect this race to the bottom, right? They prevent that some firms are specializing on this very sort of cheap source of labor. Similarly, collective bargaining, so wage setting with unions and sort of worker representation, these are things that are potentially very valuable because they might prevent that firms can engage, or at least some firms can engage in this race to the bottom, which maybe as policymakers we don't want. Okay, so there's like a class of policies, anything that sort of affects wage setting is potentially useful. And to some extent, policymakers know that. So I think this is actually an area where, in some sense, policy is sometimes further than academic research. So to give you an example, the H-1B visa program in the US, it used to have for a long time, it had this prevailing wage requirement, right? So yes, you can hire an immigrant on this H-1B visa, but the wage that you pay to that worker, it needs to be sort of like a wage that seems to be fair given what's happening on the market. And that type of concept, this prevailing wage concept, it actually makes very little sense from the traditional factor proportions model perspective, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it from this monopsony perspective. So I think policymakers are sometimes, this idea is, of course, out there. It was not very prominent in academic research. The second type of policies that could really help is anything that helps the immigrants themselves. So any sort of measures that helps them integrating faster, that gives them better access to different types of jobs. We mentioned visa policy, right? That if you sort of require immigrants to stick with the same firm, that can really backfire quite heavily, not just for the immigrants, but for the native workers as well. And so in some sense, you want a policy that makes sure that these immigrant workers, they as quickly as possibly start behaving like native workers, in the sense that they're not willing to accept these dumping wages, that they are getting a good jobs at paying high wages, because that indirectly also protects native workers from this low wage competition.
But I want to challenge this idea just a little bit.
Sure,
For
yeah.
example, I have in mind one experience that Spain had in 2005, where it implemented like a really big amnesty program. It gave residence permits and on work permits to more than 500,000 or around 500,000 undocumented immigrants, right?
Yeah.
One potential effect of this that has been studied is that once immigrants get access to the to the broader set of jobs available, and they are not relegated to this very low paid informal sector,
Right.
what you see perhaps is more of this, is that competition actually starts to emerge there. Like, once I am able to work in the formal sector, now I'm better able to compete for the types of jobs that many natives do. And actually, you can find this, again, this distributional effect. Perhaps some low-skilled natives lose and some high-skilled natives win. But
Yeah.
it does seems like sort of correcting for this monopsony power actually increases the potentially negative wage effects. I really want to hear your views on this one.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not an expert on sort of what happened after the Spanish. There were different amnesties, but you mentioned the big one. You have to talk to Joan Monras. He's done very nice research about.
He has yeah.
Maybe you plan to do that. And so, of course, the distribution effects that you mentioned are going to be there, right? This is sort of, this way we can go back to the factor proportion models and say, yeah, if there are different parts of the economy, there are, for example, formal jobs and informal jobs. If previously immigrants, because they didn't have legal rights to work, if they were mostly in informal jobs, and now suddenly, because of the amnesty, you give them access to formal jobs. Of course, for native workers in those formal jobs, that's potentially additional competition. And so you're going to have these distributional effects. So certainly there are going to be potential losers among the natives as well. But what the monopsony argument tells you is that in addition to these distributional effects, which are more related to skills, to parts of the economy, you have this additional effect that now maybe the immigrants, they're not willing to accept these very low wage offers. And that channel has sort of a positive effect on natives, right? Because that means you're going to see fewer of those very badly paid jobs around. And you're going to have fewer jobs that are in some sense not accessible for natives or not attractive for natives. Now, what's the total effect of that? We are back. That's an empirical question. So I haven't worked on this particular question, but it's certainly very, very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification. And we are already approaching the 1 hour mark for our interview. And, I would still keep talking to you for a couple of more hours, but I assume you have many work to do. So I wanted to finish perhaps by asking you about these prevailing wage policies, because it's not a thing that I have heard before. And can you sort of explain how they work? How can you demonstrate that you are paying a prevailing wage?
Yeah. The short answer is I can't tell you the details because I haven't worked on that particular requirement, and it's like it's a US context that I've worked actually less on. How exactly it's implemented in practice, I don't fully know. The conceptual idea is very clear, right? Ideally, you want immigrants to work at whatever sort of is let's say, the average wage in a profession or for a particular type of job. Now, the issue with that is that, of course, it's very hard to judge what is the prevailing wage. And I think that's also where we immediately come to sort of the limitation of that type of policies. Because if firms have an incentive to pay lower wages, there might be many ways to get around that, right? Let's say you just put the immigrant into like a lower occupational title that is linked to lower wages, even though maybe the immigrant actually does more complicated work and would deserve to be better paid. Or maybe the immigrant is working more hours than a typical native worker, right? Or is working at worse conditions. There's some evidence in the literature by Anthony Edo and others showing that immigrants often work in jobs that have just worse conditions. And so there are probably many ways to get around that. In the European context, I think the more typical version of this type of rule is the collective bargaining system, right? In many European countries, you have strong collective bargaining. And so if you hire a worker into a particular job, there is a certain wage for that type of job that you're supposed to pay. Okay, and so that sort of plays a similar role as this prevailing wage requirement. And so, yeah, these sort of policies, they are potentially useful, but you already put your finger on what's the problem is. Probably easy to some extent, it's easy to get around these policies. And it's it's difficult for policymakers to determine what a fair wage is supposed to be. And so, so one option is we wrote sort of like a policy paper, making some policy prescription together with some other authors. And what we proposed in that paper is that one way sort of to prevent these negative side effects of immigration is to link immigration more explicitly to the collective bargaining system. So the idea would be that if you are like as a firm, you know best what type of worker you need, right? If you need immigrant labor because you can't fill certain positions, maybe you need very skilled, very specific type of immigrant labor, the government should not be in the business of telling firms whether they need those types of workers or not. Okay, so the firms know best. This is not, we don't want too much bureaucracy in that process. But if the firm wants to hire immigrant labor from abroad, they need to be in the collective bargaining system. So there needs to be a mechanism that basically prevents firms to engage in this wage dumping. Right. So I think if we think about policy, sure, these sort of prevailing wage requirements, that can be sort of one way. But I think sort of the bigger idea is that you maybe want to strengthen the collective bargaining system and you want to prevent that firms hire outside informally or outside of the collective bargaining system and have too much wage setting power on immigrants.
Absolutely. And, here my prediction would be that if you strengthen unions and collective bargaining agreements, perhaps you find less lobbying efforts from firms, because sometimes it looks like firms are, telling that it's impossible to find workers, we're short on workers, nobody can fill these positions. But when you look at what conditions do these labor shortages offers, it's like, okay, yeah, perhaps you can try to, improve the conditions and perhaps you will get those jobs filled by natives, right?
Exactly. Yeah. This concept of labor shortage is very interesting. I mean, to some extent, of course, it's there, right? There are certain industries where firms find it very difficult to hire labor. On the other hand, it's kind of a funny concept in economics because we would think that wages adjust, right? If there are not enough workers who want to do a certain job, then maybe firms need to pay higher wages. Then they're going to find those workers. There's the economist Alan Manning had made in an interview with the Financial Times made a very interesting comparison. He said that imagine there's a company that produces a product and it doesn't find enough people buying its product, right? And so imagine the company now goes to the government and says, look, people are not buying my product. You need to do something so that I have more consumers buying my product. Of course, we would say that that's crazy, right? Maybe your product is too expensive. Maybe it's too bad. You need to change the price of your product. But somehow for labor markets, it's a much more prominent argument, right? That if natives are not willing to do certain jobs, rather than increasing wages in those occupations, we need sort of to bring in immigrants in. And so I don't want to be too negative about it because, of course, it's, if you think about demographic change, for example, if you think about, requirements in the care sector, it is very intuitive that to some extent we do want to bring immigrant labor in, that there might be sort of benefits on all sides by bringing in more labor in. But as you said, it's kind of a bit funny to have these discussions. And then at the same time, in many of these industries, the conditions are very bad, right? Like nurses in the care sector, they earn very little. And so what we shouldn't do is allowing complete industries to become fully dependent on immigrant labor as very bad conditions and sort of excuse firms for paying very, very low wages, right? So we first would like to see
actually happens. It happens, right? We have across Europe some specific sectors that without immigrants, I think they would not be competitive, And they're
of course, agriculture. For example, a typical example in many countries, that's mostly immigrant labor, and the wages are very low, of course.
What should we do with these types of sectors? What do you think?
It's hard to say. I said to some extent, of course, it's intuitive that maybe if immigrants with few formal skills come in, maybe these are good industries for them to work in. Maybe there are benefits for not for everyone, but for most natives in the sense of lower prices for agricultural products. So to some extent, this is good, right? That we have a high immigrant representation in certain industries that are not very attractive for native workers. What I would argue is that we don't want to get this out of hand in the sense that industries become entirely dependent of immigrant labor for different reasons. I mean, one reason is that it's just it's more sensitive to shocks. We saw that to economic shocks. We saw that after Brexit, for example, there were certain occupations like truck drivers or agricultural helpers where they suddenly didn't have enough immigrants anymore and they struggled to fill those jobs. So the other argument is, of course, just for the immigrants themselves. The conditions in some of these industries are very bad. Immigrants are working for very low wages, for very bad conditions. And the question is sort of how far as policymakers do we want this allowed to take place?
Yeah, so Jan Stuhler, thanks very much for this interview. I really enjoyed it. The viewers will have this interview available in a couple of months. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your participation.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was very interesting. Thanks a lot for having me. Ciao, ciao.
Yeah, ciao, Jan.